news emerged out of the UK of the Papal Nuncio to the United Kingdom, that is the Vatican's ambassador to the bishops and the government of the United Kingdom, that the Pope will not be revoking Traditionis Custodes, that instead he will grant generous extensions. Now, given that Benedict XVI's probably most true statement of everything he ever said was that what was once deemed good by the church before cannot be suddenly deemed bad now, to paraphrase him, in reference to the traditional Mass, how it can be generous to offer extensions of the implementation of Traditionis Custodes, I don't know, especially since there have been plenty of extensions given already. Covered them many times. We'll go over the story itself. And curiously, this news is causing some traditional Catholics to be happy. There is now a movement among some voices to get us back to the 1984 permissions, which is essentially you can have the traditional Mass if your bishop allows you to, and if Rome allows him to. It was the worst place to be other than before 1984, which was basically nothing at all, except for in a handful of places. Let's go initially to the story. First, we'll start here with the Latin Mass Society chairman Joseph Shaw posting this out of the UK. Catholic News Service has squeezed out a non-denial from the Dicastery for the Destruction of the Faith on this story about the bishops being told the request for TLM permissions would be granted. The spokesman, Monsignor Murphy, slides over the point that while the Dicastery can give extensions to 2-year permissions, they clearly have not been consistently doing so up to now. The implication is they will consistently be given 2-year extensions. This was in a message to the bishops of the UK. That's important. That is context here. Now we'll see if other reporting says otherwise, that this is going to be universal across the church, across the entire West. But as this was happening, there were Latin Mass shutdowns announced in the United States. So keep that in mind. It's all context for the story. That's why I'm so puzzled why some people are taking this as a positive development. I think this is just a development, honestly. We go to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops website with the headline, Nuncio in Britain says Pope won't overturn restrictions on Old Latin Mass. Fascinating how the U.S. Conference of Bishops are referring to it as the Old Latin Mass. The quote-unquote news about Pope Leo XIV and pre-Vatican II Mass following the plenary assembly of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales is not so new after all. By Cindy Wooden. Now, some of the people out there in social media who are claiming this is actually a positive development point out that Cindy Wooden is a notorious progressive and virulent enemy of the traditional Mass. And they basically accuse her of lying. I'm going to take what she's reporting at face value, because to accuse her of lying about something that would be verifiable is a bit much, especially when she's got the endorsement here of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Again, when a bishop's news site, the official news website of a bishop's conference, posts an article about something, unless they post a disclaimer to it, you can take it as generally they're endorsing the message. Here's the details. Pope Leo XIV does not intend to overturn Pope Francis's limits on celebrating the traditional Latin Mass, but will grant 2-year dispensations to bishops who ask, a nuncio said. Archbishop Miguel Mori Buendia, the Apostolic Nuncio to Great Britain, told bishops November 13th that Pope Leo told him he would not abrogate Traditionis Custodes, Pope Francis's 2021 letter, greatly restricting the celebration of Masses according to the 1962 Roman Missal, the Latin liturgy in use before the reforms, I would put quotes around that, of the Second Vatican Council. The Vatican press office did not respond to a request for comment, but the Archbishop made headlines by telling members of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales that the Pope would grant bishops who request it a 2-year renewable exemption. Now, here's your keyword. 2 years, in theory renewable, but it's Pope or bishops who request it. The exemptions are nothing new, a Vatican official told Catholic News Service November 14th. That is 100% true. These are nothing new. There is no more than a restatement of the practice for the dicastery of divine worship and the discipline of the sacraments since the motu proprio came into force, said Monsignor Enda Murphy, an official at the dicastery. What the nuncio is clearly referring to is the necessity for a diocesan bishop to request a derogation from Article 3, subsection 2 of Traditionis Custodes, in order that the Mass, according to the Missale Romanum of 1962, can be celebrated in a parish church, he said. basically what had happened before this announcement, you would get, looks like maybe a 60-40 split. 60% of the bishops, give or take, who asked for an exemption for the TLM to be offered in a parish church would be denied. 40% would be not denied. And they had to express reasons in this request. Maybe this will go up to like 80-20 in favor of keeping a parish mass. And yes, extensions can be a extension upon extension, but we don't know how long that's going to be until we see it in practice. The subsection referred to by Monsignor Murphy says that a bishop can designate one or more locations where the faithful who had been celebrating the older Mass could continue to do so. Quote, not, however, in the parochial churches and without the building of new personal parishes. In late October, various Catholic news outlets reported that the Diocese of Cleveland, led by Bishop Edward C. Malezic, had received permission for the older Latin Mass to continue at 2 parish churches in his diocese. In July, Bishop Michael Siss of San Angelo, Texas, confirmed that he had made a similar request, which was granted. Pope Leo also personally granted permission for U.S. Cardinal Raymond Burke, a former Vatican official, to celebrate the older form of the Mass in St. Peter's Basilica in late October. And I've reported many times since Traditionis Custodes that there were extensions granted. I also reported many times how extensions were not granted. It all hinged on who was asking and how they asked. When Pope Francis issued the restrictions, he declared the liturgical books promulgated after the Second Vatican Council to be the unique expression of the lex orandi, or the law of worship of the Roman Rite, restored the obligation of priests to have their bishop's permission to celebrate according to the extraordinary or pre-Vatican II Mass, and ordered bishops not to establish any new groups or parishes in their dioceses devoted to the old liturgy. At the time, Pope Francis said his decision was meant to, quote, promote the concord and unity of the church, end quote. And of course, it actually did the opposite of that. Sent many people to TLMs while they could still get them. We all saw that in real time at our parishes. And this part here where the priest restored the bishop having the right to declare whether or not the Mass can be said in his diocese. A priest had to get permission. While it was true that Summorum Pontificum made it so the priest didn't have to ask permission, the practice was bishops who did not want the TLM offered in a parish would still stop it. That was the practice. Many, many cases of that. So the best reading you can give of this, and I've seen this as the most like inclusive reading of this, is that maybe we're going to get a breather. Maybe. But remember, it requires your bishop to do the asking. But here's the thing. This was told to the bishops by the nuncio to the bishops of the United Kingdom. He did it on the 13th. In the United States, the bishops were also meeting with the Papal Nuncio. And he didn't tell them anything like this. What he told them was essentially to go fight the Trump administration on immigration. That's what he told them. So we shall see if this is going to be the case when it comes to any place outside the UK. People tend to think it will. Let's wait and see. But here's The Pillar reporting on this, because they did a little digging, contacted their sources in Rome, and said, with the headline, Leo posted granted generous exemptions to Traditionis Custodes, UK bishops told. Leo will ask Cardinal Arthur Roche, prefect of the dicastery, to be generous. And reportedly, yesterday, Leo met with Cardinal Arthur Roche in a private audience. He also met with the bishop who is the ordinary for the lone diocese in the entire world, where the only form of the Mass offered is the traditional Latin Mass. It's in Brazil. I can't remember the name of it. If you remember the name of it, put it in the live chat or in the comments. But he met with him yesterday. And some of us are going to watch that very carefully. Excuse me. I'm sick, by the way. Please bear with me. Sources close to the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales told The Pillar that Pope Leo appears posed to grant widespread exemptions to Traditionis Custodes without revoking the motu proprio itself. If you're familiar with the story of the sword of Damocles, well, then you'll understand that this looks like a sword of Damocles now, hovering over the heads of bishops and of faithful. Archbishop Miguel Mori Buendia, Apostolic Nuncio to Great Britain, gave a recent address to the Plenary Assembly of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales, informing the bishops that the Vatican would be generous when asked to dispense from restrictions to the traditional liturgy, a senior cleric told The Pillar. According to one source present for the address, the nuncio explained that while Pope Leo is not minded to change Traditionis Custodes, but as there are many different rites in the church, there's no reason to exclude the TLM. The details were a bit blurry, said one source. Of course, ambiguity. But the nuncio did convey that while pastors of parishes would still need the approval of their bishops to offer the extraordinary form of parish churches, and diocesan bishops would still need to apply to the dicastery for divine worship for permission, Leo will ask Cardinal Arthur Roach to be generous. You know, the question I have here, is this only for the UK? Why weren't the American bishops told this? You might think, well, you're just being nitpicky. No, I'm not just being nitpicky. For the people who take issue with a lot of things I say on this channel, I'm not being nitpicky, and I'll show you a couple of reasons why. At the same time that story was breaking, this suddenly hit the news in the United States. Damian Thompson, a traditionally minded conservative Catholic, associate editor of The Spectator, host of the Holy Smoke Religion podcast, some very interesting episodes of that podcast. He had an interview that's always stuck with me with Cardinal Pell, probably 3-4 years old at this point, for obvious reasons, but if you can go through his archives and find it, it's a fascinating interview. This is from the Diocese of Austin, Texas. This is Damian Thompson describes what I'm about to read to you as a, quote, sinister memorandum regulating and discouraging the practice of kneeling for Holy Communion. This is all an extension of Traditionis Custodes, the all-out attack on actual traditional practices in the Mass, whether it's the traditional Latin Mass or in the Novus Ordo. Here's the memorandum from the Diocese of Austin, sent to all the priests of the diocese. Over the past few years, the practice in some parishes of placing a kneeler out for the distribution of Holy Communion has become more common. Some priests report that the reason for bringing out the kneeler is that some people who kneel for the reception of Holy Communion are finding it difficult to stand back up after receiving. If this is the case, the priest should have a pastoral conversation with the communicant to explain that they are not offending God by not kneeling, and that they have the priest's recommendation to stand to receive our Lord with reverence and devotion. There are two kinds of people who use those kneelers. People who, in general, want to kneel to receive our Lord, who would use an altar rail if they could. And the other are the elderly who also want to receive our Lord, but have to use a kneeler or an altar rail to do it. The principal difference is this. The people in the first group, as long as the church allows them to do it, will kneel on the floor if need be to receive. Whereas the elderly will not be able to. The outrage I saw over this in the last couple of days were people pointing out that many of the older Catholics, 70-year-olds, 80-year-olds, will now not be allowed to kneel to receive communion because they will not be able to get back up off the floor, as well as anybody with some kind of physical handicap. Bishop Garcia asks that the practice of setting out a kneeler for Holy Communion be discontinued. The basis for this decision is offered here. The general instruction of the Roman Missal, that's the guidebook for the Novus Ordo Mass, states, quote, the norm established for the dioceses of the USA is that Holy Communion is to be received standing unless an individual member of the faithful wishes to receive communion while kneeling. 2, the placing of a kneeler near the distribution of Holy Communion could confuse the faithful regarding what is the norm, while sending a message that one way of receiving Holy Communion is more or less appropriate, meaning it's superior to receive kneeling. Can't have people thinking that you should kneel before Jesus Christ, after all. And 3, placing a kneeler near the distribution of Holy Communion could put undue pressure on the communicant to receive communion kneeling, which may not be his or her desire. These are all moral relativistic and feelings reasons for it. This is modernism in practice. The bishop appreciates the reverence of our parishioners for the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. The faithful are also permitted to kneel to receive Holy Communion. At the same time, it is important to catechize the faithful that one can receive Holy Communion with the same reverence while standing, and that there should not be an emphasis on kneeling for Holy Communion by priests, deacons, and lay liturgical leaders. And you get this, you get other announcements, things coming out of Charlotte and Detroit and things about the crushing of the traditional Mass. And some laymen aren't having it anymore. We'll wrap up with this. This is from LifeSite. Open letter slams Bishop of Charlotte over his disgust for the traditional. You can't attract Protestants by being more like them, because if what they want is Protestantism, they're not going to become Catholic to get more of the same. If you're wondering what he's talking about here, what the author of this piece is talking about, the reforms of the Mass were said by Roman officials as removing all the stumbling blocks from communion with Protestants, that they would come home if we just removed the things that they found troublesome. The problem is, the things that many Protestants found troublesome about the Catholic Mass was the real presence. Because, as some of you have probably heard, some, certainly not all Protestants, and Protestants of goodwill tend not to believe what I'm about to say. You are clearly the exception. However, some Protestants believe that we are re-crucifying Jesus Christ at every Mass. Right. So, if you're talking about removing the stumbling blocks, you got to destroy belief in the real presence, which, by the way, is what has in practice happened anyway, since the implementation of the new Mass. That is without dispute at this point. The data shows it consistently. Most Catholics who go to Mass on a regular basis at your typical parish don't believe in the real presence of Jesus Christ in the most blessed sacrament of the altar. They have a view of the Eucharist that Luther had. The facts here, as the famous man says, don't care about your feelings. So, you're not going to attract more Protestants by Protestantizing the Mass, is what this person is saying. Dear Bishop Martin, as a member of the Diocese of Charlotte, I've been amazed at the transformation of the character of our diocese over the last year. What once felt vibrant and full of life now feels cowed, disjointed, and fearful. Entire congregations of faithful Catholics feel like they are losing their home, and they rightfully feel marginalized and ghettoized reading the remarks you've made against the traditions of the faith. Particularly behind closed doors, we are unconcerned with public image, makes your disgust for the traditional evident, and would make anyone feel as though they are intentionally being pushed aside for a more preferred populace to replace them. In your letter, Go in Peace, Glorifying the Lord by Your Life, you stated things like, quote, I find it disturbing that so many pastors and celebrants are inclined to force an unknown language, Latin, on their congregation. So many of our faithful simply wake up and walk away when they don't understand the language. I cannot comprehend why a vocal minority of the faithful, who themselves admit to not understanding Latin, would advocate a revival of the Latin language within our diocese, rendering the liturgy unintelligible for all but a few of our people. All these parts are rendered less engaging by the use of Latin. The first unacceptable tendency is a rejection of the Novus Ordo Missae. Second, pastoral leaders who use Latin in the liturgy are creating within their own communities a divide between the haves and have-nots. This fosters a clericalism that is unacceptable. To instruct the faithful that kneeling is more reverent than standing is simply absurd. This reminds me of what my Novus Master taught us years ago. Don't try to be holier than Holy Mother Church. Overly ornate vestments that put more focus on the ministers than the Eucharist. Latin responses and masses are not to be utilized in parish churches during regular celebrations since they hinder people's participation. I'm going to interrupt the bishop here as he's owning himself. Most of these are rejections of the instructions of Vatican II on the liturgy. They go right up to the line of crossing the line that the Council of Trent laid out. If you affirm that the Mass should not be ever said in Latin, that it should be said in vernacular, and that it undermines the Mass and harms the laity, and it's a harm against piety, according to the Council of Trent, you have incurred an anathema. You have excommunicated yourself and are bound for eternal hellfire by doing that. He's going right up to that line with this. Retaining the use of Masses celebrated in Latin is not opportune in our present reality, so there's the relativism, since the faithful are not accustomed to it. Even in places where they have become used to it by more recent practice, this becomes problematic for visitors and or new parishioners, or those coming to the faith for the first time. And now the writer responds to that, saying, there has been plenty of ink spilled about the contents of this letter from a sacramental, theological, or canonical standpoint, and I do not need to rehash those points made by people more educated than myself. I want to focus on the character of the letter, because you make it quite obvious by your choice of phrasing what you think of people who prefer tradition. You call us disturbing. You accuse us of driving people away. You call us uneducated and vocally opinionated. You accuse us of disobedience to the church. You accuse us of being divisive. You call our practices unacceptable on multiple occasions, and that our piety is absurd. You accuse us of trying to be holier than Mother Church and imply strongly that we have a false piety, and label us a stumbling block for visitors and converts. And he goes on, saying that he is a convert from Protestantism, and he knows as a former Protestant that this attitude they have will not bring Protestants into the church. It will actually drive them away. I bring you that, and I bring you that letter from about the kneelers, because these generous permissions require on the bishop to ask for exemptions and extensions in the implementation of Traditionis Custodes for 2-year periods. Not your priest, not your laity, your bishop. And these are the men that Pope Francis put in those last few years in many dioceses. And these are the men that Pope Leo is putting in. He is putting in the same men that he approved for Pope Francis to put in, because Cardinal Robert Prevost, before becoming the Pope, was the cardinal prefect for the dicastery of the bishops. His tasks were to oversee the bishops, to be kind of a point person for them in Rome, but also to be the one who brought candidates for promotion to the Pope, men who would become bishops, or auxiliary bishops who would become the local ordinary somewhere. These are the men who will be the ones deciding whether you get extensions to your Latin Mass or not. Now, Pope Francis and Leo have not replaced anywhere near even the majority of the bishops in the US and other places. Not yet. But the choices he's made have not exactly been the most tradition-friendly. The bishop is the one who gets to decide. I do not know why people are taking this as good news, other than maybe this means we're not going to get lightning implementation of Traditionis Custodes, at least not overtly. The personnel is policy. If you want to test this in your own diocese, and your bishop begrudgingly implemented Traditionis Custodes, if you're in a diocese like that, your best chance, you are best placed for a letter campaign, a petition, whatever it is. I tend to be skeptical of those things. But if you can tell the bishop did not want to implement Traditionis Custodes, but was doing so out of what he thought was fidelity to the church, you are now in a position to cite what was said to the bishops in the UK in a letter to your bishop, asking him to petition Rome for extensions or exemptions. But remember the caveat. The U.S. Papal Nuncio, Christophe Pierre, was meeting with the U.S. bishops at the same time that the Papal Nuncio to the UK was meeting with the bishops from the UK. The bishops to the Nuncio to the UK told the bishops of the UK that they would get extensions and exemptions. The Nuncio to the US made no such mention. That's the context here. We shall see what happens. My suspicion is they won't be as generous with the US. And it has to be because the US is essentially the capital of the traditional movement. It's where most of your lay voices are. It's where most of the bishops who are the most open about being tradition friendly and the most of the canceled priests, most of the organizations that support priests and bishops who've been canceled are based out of or funded by the United States. I don't know how generous they will be here. Proceed with caution. But if you've been thinking about a letter campaign for getting signatures from parishioners, other Catholics in your diocese to get a traditional Mass saved, you notice that their statement did not say restored. Didn't say would get restored, but an exemption, implying that that places that have already implemented Traditionis Custodes probably aren't going to be affected by this. But you can test all that with a letter campaign to your bishop. And when you do so, if there are Catholic media in your diocese that could publish your open letter, submit it to them. And let me know how that goes for you. Email address is in the description box below. Make sure, I have tons and tons of email in my inbox. I miss a lot. So make sure something in that subject line will jump out at me that this is what you're doing. And I may try to give you publicity if you think that's wise. I am not the most well-liked among the bishops, and neither are people like myself. Let me know what you think about all this in the comments, please. And please, on a personal note, prayers would be appreciated. My entire family is sick. You might be able to hear it in my voice right now. So please, prayers would be appreciated on a personal note. But let me know what you think of this in the comments, please. Like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. Sharing this on social media helps too. If you've ever thought about supporting the work we do here at Return to Tradition, your support's greatly appreciated. Options in the description box below. It's Patreon, Subscribestar, that kind of thing. Get access to a patron-only Discord. Trying to liven that place up a little bit with some new voices who are wanting to participate. I do answer questions in there sometimes. It can be a better way to get a message to me, honestly. It's available to those who are direct supporters of the work we do here. But like I said, pray for the church, pray for Pope Leo, Cardinal Arthur Roche, and your bishop. This is a time of testing. Let's see what happens. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.